Nigel Farage is considering a return to frontline politics. We'll discuss that and the odds of his success. But before we come on to it, if you like the content you hear on this channel, you won't want to catch the cold I've got whilst recording, but you will want to catch all of that daily content we do on politics, culture, and current affairs. So please consider hitting that subscribe button. It exists for a reason. But Mr. Farage, possibly making a comeback. Lock up your daughters, hide the keys to your aeroplanes. He's been spending a lot of time monitoring the illegal migrant crossings in the English Channel. He's not been doing a huge amount else apart from occasional appearances on US television, so he's had a lot of time to go wandering the coasts of this country, spotting the boats as they arrive. Anyone who follows him on Twitter has seen the videos that he posts as a result, and true to form, despite not being attached to any political party, despite not officially being a political candidate for any kind of office, Farage has still been drawing attention to this issue. He was doing it first, he was doing it most prominently, and I think some credit has to be given to him. I think the issue would have arisen one way or another, but it's very hard to ignore Farage's contribution he's a very good manager of floodlights, shall we say. But he writes in the Telegraph that he's watched the arrivals, he's also watched the official arrivals into Dover Harbour, and found evidence of unofficial arrivals whilst strolling up and down the Kent shoreline. By chronicling events in this way, he writes, I've been able to make various predictions, including that worse is to come. Indeed, originally I estimated that 20,000 people would arrive on our shores uninvited this year, and as we all know, that number has been comfortably reached already, and there are more than 5 weeks to go until 2022 ends. And he's right about this, unfortunately. I think the number was breached in September, in fact, and it's now up to about 21,000. It's already double the figure reached for the entirety of 2020, and the British government is handling this with all the skill and panache and talent and competence that it handles everything with, which is to say, like a clown running across a minefield, to borrow a quip. So Farage, he says, he's made a number of these predictions at every stage of the last 20 months, he writes. I have found the overwhelming majority of newspapers and broadcasters to be reluctant to attach the same level of importance to this issue as I do. I know why. It's because they fear being labelled racist by the Twitter mob, even though race has nothing to do with it. Yet, as the official number of arrivals for 2021 heads toward 25,000, we still don't have the Home Office figures for Tuesday, 16th of November. It does seem as though something is beginning to change. Reports are circulating that the Prime Minister has become fretful, as well he should. On his watch, the mantra of taking back control of our borders has descended into farce. This is all true. What everyone thinks of Nigel Farage, and from the perspective of this channel, I think there are things to like and things to like somewhat less. Nevertheless, you can't deny that he does have, I don't want to say a finger on the pulse because that's such a awful cliche, but having just said it, I suppose I'll have to stick with it. Now we're going to come on to a host of polling data which shows that Nigel Farage is right to suspect this, and the British public are rather more keen to discuss this and rather more keen to see something done than perhaps the national press has been, but certainly than the British government has been. So far occasionally we've had some tough talk from Priti Patel. There have been some slightly fantastical ideas floated around. Some of them were sensible. Offshore processing, for instance, is a route which could be explored. Sending them all the way to the Falkland Islands, as has been one suggestion, is probably not tenable. But otherwise, I think the best one was the apparent Home Office idea of installing a wave machine in the channel to just wash the boats back to France. I think everyone's been in cheap public swimming pools with wave machines and has been smashed against the back wall of those enough times to know that these things could probably take out most of the pathetic rafts that these migrants are coming across by. But I'm not sure of the practicality of installing a wave machine big enough to affect the entirety of the English Channel. Also the question of what you do once the rafts inevitably collapse under themselves and fall apart. Do you let people drown? Probably not a good idea. There's questions of human rights. It doesn't seem like the most practical solution, but it's sort of a sign of a government which is out of ideas, though, when these kinds of things are being floated in the press. And occasionally they are briefed, they are leaked to the press to discredit them. That's quite a common practice in government departments when things are being moved, or when, for instance, a backroom staffer has a gripe against government policy. You will tend to find the most crazy ideas sort of scribbled on the back of a fag packet ideas tend to be briefed to the press as though they are in fact foremost in the minds of ministers, when in fact they're not. Though with Priti Patel it's very hard to say. But again, all we've had from Priti Patel is words. She's very good at talking tough, but thus far has done nothing. This is one of the reasons Nigel Farage is citing for coming back. He cites the complete absence of any attempts to remove them or to send them back from whence they came. The European Parliament isn't interested. It's not even interested in tracking them. It doesn't know who they are. He cites in this Telegraph piece that we have information being shared with us by the Baltic states, which shows that there are people smuggling operations coming in from effectively the Islamic State or the remnants of Islamic State, but no one's really keeping track of any of this. So we don't know who's coming. We don't know who they are, what they want. They don't tend to arrive with identity papers, though they must have had them to get this far. Farage floats the possibility that they're dumping them in the channel before they arrive, so they can then just claim they are who they want to be. When will Boris Johnson wake up to the reality of looming disaster, he asks. Why is he content to put the rights of people who have no link to this country above the safety of his own people? Who is he trying to please? Politically, he is playing an appalling hand because by refusing to tackle the issue, he is alienating his own natural supporters and the Red Wall voters who lent him their vote in 2019. But more importantly still, in security terms, he is putting his own people in jeopardy. He needs to get his head out of the clouds and realize that he is presiding over the systematic importation of people, some of whom hate us and our way of life. I dread to think what the consequences could be. Farage concludes, over the last few weeks, I've been approached by several high-ranking donors asking me if I am considering getting back into the political arena. My gut instinct is not to do so, but I will have to give it some serious thought. There is a very good way of ensuring that he doesn't, which is for the British government to do something about the problem. This is I've got a cold, so I'm lapsing into cliche, and I do apologise for it. But it is an open goal being left by the Prime Minister. It is as though he has been placed in goal and has just wandered off to the pub whilst the match is ongoing. The only reason Nigel Farage could make a comeback and be successful is if a problem like this is left unaddressed, as it has been so far. If we move on from Farage's article, I mean, the BBC has some of the figures. This is an article from September, so the figures have inflated since by September we'd hit 17,063 people crossing in small boats, compared to just over 8,000 the previous year. The government says people smugglers face a maximum sentence of life, but we don't seem to catch any of those, and the French aren't particularly interested in helping us out. So, what does that mean? That is a meaningless sentence. Why, if you have a law on the book and nobody to catch the law breakers, you might as well just not bother with the law. The BBC reports that some 160 boats with 4,638 people on board have successfully crossed the English Channel from France in September alone. That's 4,000 people in a month. Somebody did do some very quick calculations and worked out that with the current reduced state of the entire army of the United Kingdom, migrants from the Channel would be able to overpower the English army with just a year's worth of crossings, I think it is. 2 years at most. Just to give some sense of the scale of the thing. And, of course, we're paying a huge amount of money, in some cases paying £250 per person per night to hotels to house these people. And we have, of course, a huge amount more money to spend on fighting litigation brought by grifting so-called human rights lawyers who are exploiting the wonders of semantic overload to say we stand for human rights, and therefore if you oppose us you are against human rights, without mentioning that their definition of human rights differs from most ordinary people's common understanding of the meaning of that term. The BBC notes that the Channel is one of the most dangerous and busiest shipping lanes in the world. Many migrants come from some of the poorest and most chaotic parts of the world. Many ask to claim asylum once they're picked up by the UK authorities. Well, they've all had the opportunity to claim asylum in innumerable European countries before they arrived here, and should have done so. Under the Dublin Protocol of the European Union, they are obliged to claim for asylum in the first safe country they land in. This has all collapsed because it's an unworkable policy that foists the entirety of the burden of the migration crisis on Greece and Italy in particular, to a lesser extent Spain, increasingly now Poland, as they are crossing from Belarus and being used as political pawns in a game between East and West. But the European Union has, of course, gone to great lengths to bankrupt the Greeks and the Italians, so leaving them not very well equipped to deal with this crisis. But nevertheless, a migrant who lands in Greece will have to go through 6, 7, 8 countries before they arrive in France, any one of which is safe by any meaningful definition, in any one of which they can claim asylum, in any one of which they should claim asylum. And once they have claimed asylum, there are safe and legal routes. You hear human rights lawyers all the time saying, well, the reason they're arriving in Calais is because the British government doesn't provide safe and legal routes for migration. This is a barefaced, shameless lie. We do. There are many safe and legal routes. The British government, along with the Norwegians, has spent more money than any other country in the world on aid camps in Syria, for instance, with the aim being to keep as many people there as is possible, to return them to their homes should that become available, but if not, to identify the most at-risk people and lift them straight out of the camps and straight to the UK, thereby avoiding the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the Mediterranean. If they claim asylum in the European Union, but they have family in the United Kingdom or any other legally justified means to claim asylum here or rights of residence, they can apply from those countries safely and legally, and if these cases are found to be correct, then they are allowed to come and stay here. We have safe and legal routes. People arriving in Calais and getting on boats, are by definition illegal migrants, economic migrants. They have exhausted their refugee status the moment they landed in Europe. They have exhausted it several times, travelling all the way through Europe. They would be safe in any European country, and the only reason they are continuing to cross is because they want to come to the United Kingdom for the benefits it offers, for the jobs that it offers, for the social welfare that it offers. They are economic migrants by every legal, sane definition. So, yeah, they can claim asylum when they get here. My own personal view would be to say that if any migrant crosses the Channel and arrives in this country and is picked up, they should automatically have their right to claim asylum voided. But we progress. Moving on. Of course, there is the question of what happens to these migrants once they get here, and as the BBC reports 5 days ago, we are in November the 23rd, for those watching back, only five of the 21,000 have been returned to Europe this year. 5 in 21,000. I mean, that it's virtually non-existent. I mean, what? Again, this is just an open goal for Farage. If Farage wants to come back, there is plenty of justification for him to do so, and there will be plenty of support. We'll come on to exactly what level of support presently. There will be plenty of support because the British government is inept. It's not even acting incorrectly. It's just doing nothing. Nothing at all. It has the power to do so. It is severely hamstrung by the Human Rights Act, for instance, which goes way too far in empowering spurious legal claims against the government by activist lawyers. This is a real problem. We've all seen, we've all heard about the planes ostensibly being about to take off to deport convicted terrorists in many cases, or convicted criminals, which are forestalled on the runway by activists, or else are held up by legal claims filed at the last minute by dubious lawyers. Under the Human Rights Act, and therefore they are allowed to stay. So there are systemic problems that the British government has to address, but the current Conservative government has been in power on its own for the last, 8 years? And if you include the coalition period, for 10, 11 years at this point. It's not as though they haven't had ample time to solve this problem. They have a whopping 80-seat majority. You don't have more political power than that in the British electoral system. It's very rare that you do anyway. The Conservative government won a landslide in the last election. It has all of the power and the tools it needs to fight this, but it doesn't. And they've had ample time in which to do it, and they've done nothing. The result of which being that of 22,000, it's going to be above 22,000 now, 5 have been sent back. Tom Pursglove, an immigration minister, said there had been difficulties securing returns, the BBC reports. Home Affairs Select Committee heard the number has fallen from several hundred a year before Brexit when an agreement was in place to return them. Mr. Pursglove said boats are now the route of choice. The Minister for both the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice said small boats were now being launched from a 200-kilometre, or in real people's measurements, 125-mile stretch of the French coast compared to 50 kilometres or 30 miles in the past, and the French are doing very little to actually stop this. It's notable that they are able to track and impound boats, fishing boats, individual fishing boats, which they say are encroaching on French territorial waters against the agreement struck for Brexit. They are able to do nothing to track thousands of boats. They are doing nothing, and we are paying them for this. Eric Zemmour, the French presidential candidate, well, he hasn't declared yet, but is popular enough to be a French presidential candidate. All the suspicion is that he will run. Interesting guy, talk show host, a bit sort of a French Tucker Carlson. Not hugely fond of Britain, but very fond of the French. He's recently done an interview with The Spectator in which he says that it is actually insulting for France, this arrangement, because we are sending them money as though they were a third world country. He said if he were president, the migrants would never have made it to Calais. So there are problems to work out with Mr. Zemmour. He does seem to be slightly on the Anglophobic side, but I think a little bit of French pride and dignity and honour should reassert itself after years of Macron and decades of equivalently cronyistic politicians. It is a failure of the French that they are allowing this to happen. It is a dishonourable failure to enforce agreed upon policy that is allowing this to happen. So we can hope that Mr. Zemmour at least gives Macron a close fight in the imminent election. I think it comes about in the early months of next year. He may do more to solve the problem, but until then, Mr. Persglove said, the BBC reports there is not a returns agreement with the European Union in place at the moment. You would appreciate that there have been some difficulties around securing returns, not least as a consequence of COVID. All of this would lead to the sane and sensible policy prescription, which is to do something about it before it becomes a problem, which is why more of a policy like that which we enforce in, or tried to enforce in Syria, is a sensible way to do it. It's why we have actually been allying with the Polish in their border dispute with Belarus, with the migrants there. That's one way around this, because it's very hard for British-based human rights lawyers to bring dubious legal cases with migrants who have not yet arrived on British soil. So if you can stop it at source, that would be ideal. But again, there are real and legitimate reasons that the government has been hamstrung. Nevertheless, it does still have some power and agency. It could have done more about this than it has. I think that's undeniable. Now, back to the question of Farage. So he is, as he told the Telegraph, or as he wrote in the Telegraph, he's been asked by several high-profile donors whether he is considering a return to frontline politics. He said he is going to consider it, though his instinct is not to do so. The question, of course, is how, in what form, what party would he go to? Because UKIP no longer exists really as a serious force. It's polling, I think, below 5% in many constituencies. Is no longer even standing. It's gone. I actually wrote a piece for Medium and I think a small online outlet called Spectre just before the European Union referendum, where I predicted that this would be the fate of UKIP. I said if you hate Nigel Farage, the best way to get rid of him is to vote Leave, because UKIP will break up. Lo and behold, UKIP has broken up. It was entirely predictable. I indeed predicted it. So UKIP isn't really an option, and there are internal factional reasons that Farage left in the first place. Very few people bothered to actually look into the way UKIP works, its history, how it was founded, but it was a deeply faction-riven entity, even before Nigel Farage took over. But so that's not an option. Now, there is Reform UK, of course, which is led by Farage's sometime wingman, Richard Tice. And it's hard to see that being Farage's vehicle of choice. At least he would have to take over the party and have to radically transform its messaging, because at the moment nobody really knows what Reform stands for. It's put out some vague policy prescriptions on things that actually most of the British public don't give too much of a damn about, like reform of the House of Lords, reform of the voting system to some form of proportional representation, which is a bad idea. It's good for parties like Reform, but bad for everybody else. But none of these are really headline-grabbing issues, and Richard Tice is sort of he lacks Farage's charisma, his personality, his natural appeal. We'll come on again to the extent to which Mr. Farage does in fact have appeal, but nobody really knows Richard Tice either. So Farage, if he were to join Reform UK, would have to take that party over and would have to do what he is admittedly very good at, which is reforming the message and really focusing on the one thing. This is what made him so successful as a political party leader of UKIP, what made him so successful in gaining the EU referendum, and what made him such a successful campaigner in the referendum, because funnily enough, I actually covered this in the previous video on Boris's Peppa Pig thing. His critics are all over the place. They criticise every single thing that comes to mind. Farage is a supreme political communication strategist. He finds the issue, the hot button issue, that's another damn cliche, I apologise, the hot button issue, and he focuses on that, and he hammers that home again and again and again and again and again. He has other issues that he can speak to if asked in an interview, for example, but the one thing he will do is immigration, 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 immigration. So if he were to join Reform UK, that's what he would have to do. And it doesn't really sit well with the way that Reform is currently structured, with the issues that it currently campaigns on. Whether Richard Tice would happily step aside is unclear. Whether Farage would want to join that party, again, is unclear. But, I mean, it can't exactly go much worse. Here is Reform celebrating This is a tweet from September the 10th, celebrating its best ever poll rating. Reform UK, it says, is fast emerging as the true alternative in British politics. It hit 5% of the vote. 5%. So the word "the" in that sentence is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting. I mean, the true alternative in British politics, 5%, less than the Greens, less than the SNP, which only stands in one of the 4 countries of the Union, less even than UKIP. Still a remnants of UKIP does in some seats. I'm sure in some seats the Women's Equality Party will do better. You could probably run a stuffed horse in any given election and it would poll more than 5%. Count Binface, I'm sure, polls more than 5% whenever he runs against the Prime Minister of the day. That's not a very promising place from which to start. You could argue that the only way is up, and Farage would, of course, make a difference. But yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, the true alternative, Labour on 34%, is it? I think you've got a little way to go, Reform UK, before you can claim that particular mantle. It would be a start if you actually informed people that you existed and what you stood for. But there's been a couple of reactions already to Farage's announcement. If the Mirror doesn't spam us with ads, we can go through this. The MPs were rather not a flattering picture from the Mirror, but it is the Mirror, so what do you expect? MPs weren't overly impressed. As the Mirror reports, MPs have snubbed Nigel Farage's announcement of considering a political comeback as cabinet ministers faced pressure to curb illegal crossings. The former UKIP and Brexit Party leader under the government's the former UKIP and Brexit Party leader, the government's... The Mirror is barely a newspaper at this stage, and it doesn't employ any copy editors, and no one there can write. The former UKIP and Brexit Party leader, the government's handling of the migrant crisis, had prompted him to think about getting back onto the British political scene. As my editor, I'm a journalist in real life, as my editor occasionally says to me when I've made a typo, there is something missing from this sentence. Anyway, Mr. Farage told the Telegraph he had been approached by several high-ranking donors asking him if I'm considering getting back into the political arena. My gut instinct is not to do so, but I will have to give it some serious thought. He went on to claim the migrant crisis would affect Britain's security if nothing is done, while implying he is the man to solve the issue. Pictures. Tory ministers are facing mounting pressure to curb illegal channel crossings. Obviously. Well done, Mirror, you've noticed. A small boat... Yeah, we've done all this. In the Commons, Home Secretary Priti Patel defended her efforts to tackle the crisis after claims that she's lost control of the situation. Well, if you've lost control, that sort of implies you ever had control, and there's no evidence that she did, so I'm not sure she had lost control of it. She's just failed to gain it. Labour's Nick Thomas Simmons accused Ms Patel of empty rhetoric and broken promises and blaming everyone but herself over the matter. It would be much easier for Labour to take this line if Labour's policy weren't let them all in. At least Patel sort of says good things about basic common sense. No, we shouldn't be allowed uncounted numbers of unknown fighting-age men into the country. The Labour Party criticises her for doing nothing about it, whilst advocating doing nothing about it. Labour's messaging on this is all over the place, but it is a Labour Party, so what do you expect? This is all political back and forth. The problem will take time to fix. There is no silver bullet. The only solution is whole-scale reform of our asylum system, as Patel said. No, that's just a fudge. That's fudge. All fudge. I thought the Mirror was going to lead more with MPs who said that Farage wasn't coming back. Very misleading headline, but again, we've already established they don't have copy editors. But we can move on to data, the sexy part of it. Farage's popularity goes to the question as to how successful he is likely to be. This is the thing with Nigel Farage, which is that he's, as you can see here, so everybody knows about him. 96% people have heard of him, according to YouGov. Only liked by 24%, but that is second only to Nicola Sturgeon in the country. This is an odd list. I don't know how recently this was updated, given that John Bercow and Joe Swinson and Vince Cable are all still on that list, and all of them have dearly or not so dearly departed at this point. But anyway, let's say this was 2017, 18, 19. Nothing, I don't think much would have changed about this. I mean, Farage's popularity rating sort of reflects UKIP's performances in European Union elections, for instance, the ones that always had a relatively small turnout, but always UKIP did, and then the Brexit Party did, had an outsized share of the vote in those compared to national elections, and largely driven by Farage's popularity. This is what makes Farage an interesting figure. It's what makes him probably the most influential single political figure in modern British history, but at the same time unelectable, because he has this core constituency of people who support him. about a quarter of the country, in fact, who like him, which isn't to say that they would choose him over a different politician in a general election. Too often that happened. But the other problem is that not enough people like him across the country to guarantee him success in any given constituency. So if 24% of people nationwide like Nigel Farage, that won't translate into more than 24% really in very many constituencies. Usually less than that. In almost all constituencies it will be less than that. And there are other candidates standing, of course, as well. Which means this is why he always had such trouble winning any election to Westminster. Did a reasonably good job for the European Parliament elections because they're very different things. But for Westminster, he stood several times and failed on every occasion because of this issue. He came close in, was it Batley and Spen in, and the name escapes me. He always did well, he came close in certain constituencies, but he doesn't have quite enough support beyond his core base to actually translate this into success in a general election. Nevertheless, his support base is incredibly durable, so this is virtually unchanging all throughout his certainly modern political career. This gives him a huge amount of influence because he has enough personal popularity and he can lend enough charisma to any party he is a member of to take a significant chunk of votes away from the Conservative Party, for instance, often as well the Labour Party, and that's an understated part of this. This is why UKIP and the Brexit Party did disproportionately well in Labour-held seats, but he can also deny the Conservative Party a significant number of votes and has the prospect then of not of winning an election himself, but of wrecking it for one of two sides. And that makes him incredibly important and influential. One of the reasons David Cameron did offer the EU referendum in the first place was to attempt to avoid being undercut by Nigel Farage at the subsequent general election, not because he thought UKIP would beat the Conservatives or challenge them in many seats, but they would take just enough of the vote to ensure the Conservatives would not subsequently win their own majority. So Farage has an awful lot of power and influence. It does compare... I mean, he's considering he's not the head of a party, he's not in power, he has no high office of state. A 24% popularity rating and 96% approval rate, not approval rating, popularity rate, no, fame rating, as in 96% of people have heard of him, doesn't compare unfavourably with other countries. This is the other public figures. So again, second to Nicola Sturgeon, is 25% popularity. But if you compare it to, say, the Conservative Party figures, all of these are from YouGov. Rishi Sunak, at the time, whenever this was taken, Rishi Sunak led the way, the equivalent fame rating and 36% popularity compared to Farage's 24%. Boris Johnson, 97% have heard of him. He is, after all, the Prime Minister of the country, and 34% popularity. That, I think, has dipped since. But nevertheless, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the country now, popularity only 10% above Nigel Farage, who has never held high office and is the leader of no political party and doesn't have the whole apparatus of state behind him and the budget of a whole established political party. So, it's a significant chunk of the British electorate which does quite like Nigel Farage. Significant enough for him to make a difference were he to come back. Not necessarily that he would win an election, not necessarily that he would take a seat, but that he would have impacts and influence on Conservative Party policy by threatening to take votes away from them and losing them any subsequent election. Hard though that is to believe, with the Labour Party being as incompetent as it is. If we move on again, the ground is sort of set for him. I mean, this is more recent YouGov data. It goes up till the 15th of November. 72% of the country think that the government is handling the issue of immigration badly, largely driven by coverage of the Channel migrant crisis. 72% of the country does not like current immigration policy. This, if Farage comes back, is his sole campaigning issue. And given that this is the current approval rating of the government on the question, again, Farage has a real chance of making a difference here. There are a lot of people waiting to hear from someone like Nigel Farage. The easiest way for the Conservative Party to head this off is to do something about the problem. But, despite its 80-seat majority, despite all the years it's had in power, that still looks unlikely. So that's the general perception of the UK public on the handling of immigration. If we move on, immigration is not considered to be the most important issue facing the country. It's currently at that's January this year. It's currently at 22% as of the 7th of November this year. I mean, it's been higher. It was higher just a couple of months ago. 23rd of August, for instance, it was at 29%. So it has dropped since then to 8 points, which is, unfortunately, the YouGov data doesn't go too much into the reasons behind this. It's a curious thing. Quite often you see drops like this coincide with a rise in another area of concern. So if for instance, I don't know, there might be a new coronavirus policy, a new lockdown measure enacted, something else to do with vaccines, which will push other things up the list. I think the two highest rated concerns for the public health, we find health, which is again dropped from its peak, understandably, at the outset of the coronavirus crisis of 72%, down to 48% at the moment, but I think that is still the highest rated highest rated concern by the British public over what issues facing the country. And the economy is second, I believe. The economy at 41% at the moment, again, has been higher previously, as recently as March this year, when it was 57%, down to 45%, but still very high. Just as a couple of others, in the environment you would expect to see rise because of all the attention paid to COP. Actually, not a significant jump, despite wall-to-wall coverage in every news channel. One might say wall-to-wall propaganda on every news channel. It has gone up significantly, but there's not been a surge in this. I mean, from we're talking 30% in May to 36% now. That's actually a smaller increase than the decline in, for instance, concern about immigration and crime, which is usually it's fairly static. Actually, at the moment, is only hovering at about 17-18%. So, immigration, if we go back to that, what is that? That's fifth, I think. Third, fourth or fifth. I think it's fifth in the list of top 10 concerns, which is an odd disconnect, you might think, given that 70% of the country think that something's going badly wrong with immigration, but is evidence, I think, that there are just other more pressing and immediate matters. Health, understandably, given the coronavirus crisis, and the economy as well, given that inflation is biting. Yet another on the long list of the government's incompetencies. But nevertheless, immigration is still relatively high up people's lists, so it's another reason that Farage, if he were to choose to come back, would have a solid base. And you note as well that 24% is not dissimilar to Nigel Farage's overall approval rating, 22% to 24%. This all, again, is evidence that he has this core demographic that he will appeal to. And that core demographic is large enough to cause the Conservatives some real worries, given that they have declined in the polls, and Labour has, stayed static. Keir Starmer took 2 weeks off, and they rose in the polls. The margin of error is now sufficient that the Conservatives could stand to worry if an election were held today, tomorrow, next week, next month. They'll want that to change. They have the ability to call an early election. They won't do that in the immediate future precisely because their poll rating has declined. It would be good for the country if the opposition were to bump its poll rating up a bit by taking some of these issues seriously, but as we've already said, the problem with Labour Party policy on this is that they will criticise the government for doing nothing on immigration, whilst their official policy is themselves to do nothing on immigration. So this leaves, again, a core constituency for Nigel Farage, which no one else is speaking to, which could damage the Conservatives at the next election, though that is, we have to remember, still quite some way away. It is easy to become a bit too focused on the prospect of an election held tomorrow when we've got another couple of years at least until one is likely, unless the Conservatives enjoy a substantial bump in the polls, which they might use to capitalise. Moving on, do Brits think that immigration has been too high or too low in the last 10 years? Well, 57% of people as of February this year said that it was too high. This has dropped to 50% as of the 1st of November this year, so it's a minor decline, and actually an increase of a couple of percentage points on the people who think it's about right. That's sort of 20 to 25%. But again, you've got half the country voting in a way, or thinking in a way, feeling in a way, which is not reflected by any of the major political parties, and certainly not by the government, and certainly not by the opposition, which is why it would arguably be very good for the public if Nigel Farage were to form a comeback in some fashion, if only to get more pressure on the government to take half the country seriously. We've already seen with the Brexit vote how for such a long time 80% of MPs were voting in a way that 50% of the country, 52% of the country disapproved of. This builds up resentment, and resentment in a democratic populace is not a good thing. One of the ways to get that out is to ventilate it and actually have people's views represented on the national political stage. Nigel Farage could accomplish that if he were to come back. Finally, from YouGov, which political party would be best at handling asylum and immigration? This is where the Conservative Party really should be worrying, because though, as you can see here, it's been consistently higher than every other party here, sort of hovering 33%, 37% in April last year, declines to 29%, it sort of hovers around there, 30% sharp decline then from May to June from 33 to 27%, this is where the Conservative Party has to start worrying, because the Labour Party has always been abysmal on this. As you can see, it's barely breached the 20% at all over, this is from August 2019 onwards. People, generally speaking, do not like Labour Party immigration policy. They think it's crap, which it is. Actually, I mean, hilariously, not if you're a Labour voter, but Don't Know has been consistently the second highest rated option people choose. High 30%, well, 30 to 37% is the range it sort of varies at. It's been consistent. It's barely changed, in fact, over the last 2 years. And it's been consistently second place, which again speaks to a vast number of people who are unrepresented. There is none is an option, but people, I think, assume in these cases that there must be someone who thinks what they think, but they don't know who they are. So these people are effectively underrepresented. And the problem the Conservative Party now faces is that having hovered at around 30% for much of the last 2 years, we see in the last few months it dropped to 29%, to 27% in August, to October, 26%, and now has just plummeted down, as we see there, to 21%. That's almost tied with the Labour Party, and it puts Don't Know as the most popular choice for people who say in the question, which party would be best at handling immigration and asylum, the answer majority of the people in the country pick now is Don't Know. And that's a pretty shameful indictment of the British political system and its failure to represent people's views, its failure to communicate its own policies, or its failure to come up with policies worth communicating, as in the case of the Labour Party. And again, for Nigel Farage, this is all good news, because everyone knows where Nigel Farage stands on this matter. UKIP is barely showing up on this. In fact, it stopped polling UKIP at about March 2020. But Nigel Farage, as we've explained, probably wouldn't go back to UKIP. It would be interesting to see where Nigel Farage would place on this equivalent line here. I suspect he would be tipping Don't Know. I think at least then you'd have someone with a clear policy which is supported by a majority of or at least the plurality of the British electorate. So all of this bodes well for Nigel Farage should he choose to make a comeback of some kind. I think he's done quite an effective job outside politics. If he were to choose to come back, I don't think he would win a seat, unless the current crisis continues. But it's principally bad news for the Conservative Party, but if he were to decide to run, because they are losing all the credibility they came in with, despite having this whopping great majority and being in charge of the immigration system in this country for the better part of a decade, if not more than a decade. They've done nothing. Farage coming back would be bad news for them, and it might spur some kind of action, spur them to action, which would be good news for the country. So I think, cautiously, this channel would probably welcome Nigel Farage's return to frontline politics, were he to choose to do so. But, well, we'll wait and see.